To all of you, good evening. I also hope you're all enjoying your beer, and will do so during the next rough, I would say, half an hour to maybe 40 minutes, where I actually intend to give you a brief introduction, very brief introduction to agroforestry. And of course, I will also try to touch the topic of sustainability, since the whole thing should be in the spotlight of it. With that said, I actually first want to take a step back, or go back in time a little bit and take you along. We'll see if this will work, because I was already told it might be hard from here. There we go. So since people actually formed the first permanent settlements, people have changed their environment significantly. They have adapted their environment to their needs. And all this began roughly 12,000 years before Christ, as far as we know, in what is referred to as the Fertile Crescent, which nowadays would be in the region of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And the basis for this, or the possibility to actually live a sedentary lifestyle, was a stable climate and the ability to domesticate animals and plants. As you can see, the early domestications were pig, boar, sheep, goats, etc. And this was a huge change actually in the life of humans. As you all know, for hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived a nomadic lifestyle. And since this change was so massive, it is also referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. And what actually happened, more or less, was that people tried to order their environment, to cultivate their environment, by draining landscapes, by clearing landscapes from forest cover, by leveling areas, by building dikes to get more land, and then also by finally cultivating these sites they produced. And you might know nowadays we roughly have 5 billion hectares of land for agricultural use of the more or less 15 billion hectares of terrestrial land we have. And these 5 billion hectares include actually most of the fertile land we have. So the only areas where new land can be won is, for instance, through more deforestation activities, etc. So since we had this Neolithic revolution, more or less this process is going on. We are shaping the world, we are changing the world to supply us with the most basic needs in view of food, in view of other resources. Here are just a few examples for some of the historic land use forms. And you can imagine, since people are interacting in this way with nature, of course, they would also selectively promote specific species, trade these species among regions. All this, to a certain extent, led to a homogenization of the terrestrial land we have. Here, just as an example, pig fattening, as we assume it to be from images in the medieval ages. You can see this image in the middle is photography taken in the early 20th century. So there was not actually a huge development in view of how agriculture changed over time until the early 20th century. However, we can be quite sure that throughout this whole time, the abundance of specific species, etc., has massively changed based on the needs humans had. A few more impressions. In this case, of course, pigs were not the only animals that were sent into the forest to feed. Here we see forest pasture with cattle. Also an image from the 19th century and a current photography of this. And even though all these activities most likely did lead to a certain homogenization of landscapes in or with the aim of adapting these landscapes to the needs of the humans of the times, actually we nowadays still see relicts of these historic land use forms. And this is such an example you can actually still visit if you visit the Saberburg. Saberburg is actually if you look on their internet page, it will say Urwald Saberburg, primary forest Saberburg. Yeah, and the reason for this is simply that this is how a lot of people do imagine primary forests to be: very big trees, huge crowns, interesting shapes, of course, and of course very old trees. However, this is a result of the cultural use of our landscapes, and actually doesn't have too much to do with the way primary forests might have been in Central Europe, most likely. However, even though huge parts of homogenization, etc., took part in Central Europe, we can be quite sure that actually the landscape itself was extremely diverse. And a lot of the biological diversity we still refer to nowadays is a result of these different cultural or historic land use forms that took place quite clearly. So on a landscape level, the management and the use of these resources has strongly diversified the landscape and most likely increased the biodiversity. However, there was for a long time no thought at all about sustainability. So increase of biodiversity, but the land use forms themselves not necessarily. This partly came later. And this not minding, we'll see. Could you check if you're still in the presentation? There we go. Thank you. Yeah. And this actually in a situation or the effects of the land use were actually quite clear to the people. This is a text which I just freely translated down here, a text from Virgil. Virgil maybe is better known actually as the guide of Dante in the Divine Comedy. However, if you look at his text, what he wrote actually in Roman times, he's more or less advertising the two-field system. So they could just through their observations already observe what parts of this text, what you can see down here. So states more or less leave the soil at rest every 2 years so that it can recuperate its strength. Line and seed dries up the soil. Do not be afraid to fertilize the soil with strong manure and to scatter the dirty ashes on exhausted fields, etc. So there was quite a clear understanding that by using the landscapes, they are somehow depleting the soils, productivity goes down, and what they can do about it are, for instance, to stop managing the soils for a while, to add on certain components to the soil to increase the productivity again, etc. And actually, since I think this will not work most likely. Yeah, don't worry. Just there we go. Now it's back again. Yeah. And actually, since Karl Sprengel and Liebig, we actually have quite a precise understanding of how plants nourish themselves, what they need, what the basic elements are that they need. Sprengel, the person who more or less laid the scientific foundation, and Liebig, the person who popularized the concept of the minimum theory, yeah? Which more or less states that a plant will only grow as well as the limiting factor on the site allows it to grow. However, again, if we look at a few images, photographies, again, from the early 20th century, we can see that all these land use forms were not what we would consider sustainable nowadays. What you can see here are actually early forms of fertilization especially in areas where the soils were not good. Material from the forest was transported out onto the fields, often through the stables of the animals, where it was enriched with manure and then brought onto the fields. This was litter, so raking up litter from the forest, transporting it to the fields. And this what is called Pluggenheap, which was also removing the top humus layer and transporting that to the fields, was a typical practice which depleted the forest sites and fertilized the fields. So the effect worked. However, this is not what we would consider to be sustainable. Similar to the early management forms, coppice forests with very short rotations, clear-cut systems every 10 to 20 years, removal of all the biomass. Also, these systems partly were not sustainable, especially if they were paired with also removing the green biomass for winter fodder of the animals. So actually, we're facing a time until the early 20th century in which people were, as we are nowadays too, heavily dependent on nature. This has not changed, but the ability to control nature, that has quite strongly changed. So until the 20th century, famine and effects like that happened again and again throughout history. You will know in the 19th century, the Irish, big parts of the Irish population left the island because of repeated misharvests of potatoes. You will know after the Second World War, maybe in Germany, in the cold winters of 46, 47, we had famine here. In China, there was, I think, the worst catastrophe in the 20th century under Mao Zedong, etc. So that was the situation in which people were living with nature, living from nature, heavily dependent on the systems, not a lot of options somehow to control these systems. And this then led to the so-called, can you just move along, Green Revolution, yeah? The Green Revolution, which happened in the 60s of our time. And the Green Revolution more or less pushed the boundaries of science and of industry, and with that also by translating these technologies into agriculture, pushed the boundaries of agriculture and revolutionized the way agricultural systems were used until then. So the heavy use of fossil energy, the use of highly bred species on the fields, the intensification, industrialization has totally changed the way agriculture is being practiced until today. This all started more or less in the 60s. The consequences for this, for the agricultural systems, the consequences of the intensification was simply that on a global scale, most of the traditional land use forms had to be stopped, replaced by intensified systems, or the fields had to be abandoned because these small management systems did not make as much sense anymore, were not efficient, could not compete on a global scale, on a global market. This led to land consolidation. So from these small scale structures, the result of the historical land use forms, the results or the conditions under which or that were able to support high levels of biodiversity, etc. All this disappeared quite heavily throughout the world in areas where this intensified land use form is being practiced. And actually, there was even in Germany a law from the 70s, as you might be able to see, which states that you are allowed to clear structures from your field if this improves the productivity. The German word for this is the Flurbereinigung. Yeah? So there was a law on that actually made the people clear their sites to like restructure the landscape, what simply meant to homogenize the landscape, to increase the field size, to remove woody components, etc. And another result of this, obviously, is on the one side, productivity of the systems increases. So if one farmer fed 4 people in round about 1900, 50 years later, this has multiplied by 2.5. another, well, 60 years later, this value has multiplied by roughly 15. That is the effect of the green revolution. Most likely in 2050, this value will have to increase again, especially if you think about, I just recently was told, I missed that we just broke the 8 billion mark in human population size. This will continue to increase. Actually, I remember in our last lecture, I gave you a wrong value, so we're 8 now. Yeah. I also learned that, and what is also, or the prognosis is also that the population is not only increasing, but most likely the wealth will also increase. With that, the nutritional demands will increase. And against that background, predictions state that the productivity actually of the agricultural landscapes will have to increase by between 60%, and some estimations even say it has to double, so by 100%. That's the situation we are kind of left in. Thank you very much. The aim of the Green Revolution was to improve the food situation. And looking back, we must say this worked. There was a massive improvement of the food situation around the globe. The reason for this is what I mentioned before, so more efficient machines, infrastructure, modified, optimized plant and animal material that would grow quick and a lot. All the intensified forms of production, the fossil energy sources that are there to increase the efficiency, etc. And of course, what I didn't mention before, but all the chemical compounds, be it in view of fertilization, be it in view of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc. And the results of this is kind of what you see over here, or maybe you're not able to see it, but I'll tell you. So the red part in the bottom shows the amount of people living in poverty and threatened by hunger. And then we see this blue steep line, which is the population. And you can see the development of the population until 2015. Development of the population increases almost exponentially since the 60s. This is a result of the Green Revolution. You can also see, and I think this is also an important point, if we look back in the 19th century, but also in the beginnings of the 20th century, how big the proportion of people actually was that was still threatened by poverty and hunger, and how this separated massively as a result of the Green Revolution. And actually, back in the days, it was really just a small percentage, 1% of the population that could be considered wealthy, that did not really have to worry too much about where they would get their food from, etc. However, these are global consequences, and thank you. The other consequences are serious environmental damage as a result of the management practices we are facing, as a result of the intensified use of fossil energy, etc. So the increased homogenization, simplification of the system, the dangers you are always associated in monocultures, the problems we're facing in a lot of agricultural sites now in view of soil productivity. So we have reached maximum productivity on a lot of sites. More fertilization will not increase productivity any further. The consequences of bad soil or bad agricultural practice, desertification, soil degradation, soil erosion, etc. Biological diversity, biological automation are threatened on a global scale. And to get more land, like I mentioned before, most of the fertile soils on the ground are under management already. Other soil that can be managed is often under forested area. So deforestation continues to spread, and with that, environmental pollution, and overall, all these factors concerning global change or climate change. That's the situation in which we are now, and that is the reason why people are looking for alternatives. And if you would move along, thank you. And what people say now against this background is that actually we need a greener revolution. So now really green in the sense of what we consider green to be nowadays, so a more ecologic direction that our land use systems must take. And in this context, smart farming or agriculture 4.0 are often mentioned as possibilities to face the future challenges we will be confronted with. And these, or the ideas here, are actually based on making use of the current technologies we have, especially around object recognition, artificial intelligence, etc., and implement those more strongly into our agricultural systems to make them more environmental friendly. And the hope is that by doing this, we will also be able to move away from these large machines that are currently being used, the resulting effect of this, the whole economy of scale, that we depend on large fields for this to be efficient, etc. And the hope is we can move away from this without totally moving back into historic land use forms that might not be productive enough for the population size we currently have around the globe. And the questions we have to ask for agriculture are actually, might there be new agricultural concepts we can currently think about? Can we maybe think again about small-scale designs, more heterogeneous designs, more structured landscapes against this background? Yeah, how is it in general with restructuring and diversifying the systems? And against this background, agroforestry itself is also discussed as one option to increase the sustainability of systems around the world that are still producing products we are all dependent on. So, with that said, what is agriculture? Here you see a ton of definitions. The reason for that is simply that agriculture as a scientific topic is being focused on since about the 80s. But you don't have to go through these in detail. If we look through them, you will see that there are a few aspects that simply can be found in all these definitions. And we'll try to hop through there, or I might move closer. So on the one side, we're speaking about a land use system. Okay, so agroforestry is not to be considered as a somehow mixture of forestry or agriculture. It is a new land use system, a third land use system if we think about our terrestrial sites. Then we can also see that we are somehow dealing with a combination of different species. Unfortunately, I'm just noticing that the text is different than on my slides, but it's no big deal. So you get the idea. You can see something, woody plants, annual crops. You see some kind of mixture up here, a combination over here with woody, shrubs over here, trees, etc. So that is another factor. And then we can see that these should be somehow on the same piece of land. They should be mixed. They should be somehow combined. And finally, one last point, harder to see, this gray area, which is wrong up here, but down here it fits. So another intention of agroforestry systems is that they should somehow optimize the system, make it better in some kind of way. And for a long time, of course, this was based on productivity. So if we summarize this, agroforestry is a land use system in which perennial woody crops and or trees are combined temporarily or spatially with annual crops and or livestock on the same production site. That is more or less the basis. And then down here in the second part of the sentence, you can see that these systems also should have some kind of advantage over those systems in which the components you find in the agroforestry system would grow in monoculture. So there should be some kind of advantage there. So if we kind of summarize what we spoke about so far, we have the historic land use forms. Then at some point, or the first systematic land use form was the agricultural land use. Forest was exploited for the needs of agriculture. At some point in time, these separated, most likely more or less when an active forest management was required to maintain the sustainability of the forest systems. Then for a long time, these systems worked separately in the landscape. And now we're actually at a point where we want to merge the knowledge and understanding of these land use systems into a new land use system, which would be agroforestry. And if we go into a bit more detail, then agroforestry is further distinguished in 3 different general concepts based on combining these red highlighted words in different way. We have agri-silvicultural systems, we have silvipastoral systems, and we have agri-silvipastoral systems. Those are the 3 big groups of agroforestry systems that are currently being applied. And as you can see, in all these systems, as the definition suggests, the woody component somehow has to be included. That makes the system an agri-forestry system. Okay, and here just a few more images, how you can imagine these systems nowadays. So in this case, we say the agri-silvicultural system in which wood components are being combined with different field crops, in this case, wheat on the left side and coffee on the right side. Coffee actually an interesting case because you will know coffee also grows on shrub-like woody species. Nevertheless, shade-grown coffee is also considered as agroforestry system. The same, by the way, for cocoa systems. Few more impressions, silvipastoral systems. In this case, the woody components often have a service function for the livestock grazing under these systems. So a bit related to the historic forest pastoral systems we spoke about before. And finally, agri-silvipastoral systems. These images are just a basic representation of these systems. Over here, you can see 3 elements. So the livestock, the woody component, and the field crop in more or less harmony. Over here, you can see a lot seems to be missing. The reason why I chose this picture nevertheless is that you can see a fence over here, especially in these systems that try to combine all 3 elements at once on a production site. You are required to separate the components over time, because most likely the animal component could or will damage the field crop. And this may be just as a little summary. So agroforestry system consists of 2 or more species, different plant or plant and animal species, perennial woody species. We are aiming for at least 2 products, all based on the definition we spoke about. One of the products is being produced over a time frame of more than 1 year, another difference in view of the agricultural systems. And another characteristic of agroforestry systems is simply that they are more complex than their monoculture counterparts in view of managing these systems. And the reason for this is simply that you are dealing with the requirements and the ecology of different species and trying to match these, which simply always is more complicated than only dealing with one species. And how these interactions take place in agroforestry systems is, on the one side, as abiotic, or the individual components interacting with their abiotic environment. On the other side, they're interacting with one another. They interact above and below ground. Both is managed in agroforestry, and they interact differently across seasons and years. And finally, you will know this from your biology classes, the interactions usually are a combination of positive, neutral, or negative effects on the individual species. So we have some probiosis systems, some antibiosis systems, and all this has to be considered while managing the systems. And the aim here is simply to more or less make use of as many positive interactions as you can to combine mutualistic or complementary species, but also to know the negative interactions and the effects these have, and to use all these effects to guide the system towards the production goal you might have. And the way this is done, similar to actually all land use forms, is through introducing components to the system and through simulating disturbances to the system. And yeah, against this background, these negative interactions, they will set certain limits of the system. The positive interactions offer the potential, and mostly it's the additional woody component that is what modifies the systems quite strongly. So we are constantly dealing with what we refer to as trade-offs, and these trade-offs are the basis of agroforestry management. So you always have to more or less weigh the positive effects against the negative effects, and as long as the positive effects or interactions prevail, then the system makes sense. Then we also get the benefits that we are aiming for with agroforestry. Okay, now we're going to speak about how we can work with these interactions before I close this presentation on showing you different agroforestry systems and their main goals. Again, here, if we look at general separations, then we can separate the components on a temporal scale. So we can use components simultaneously, or we can use components sequentially. And what this means is simply that if you try to use the different species in a simultaneous way, you want the effects they have on one another to happen the whole time while the product you're aiming for is being produced. And sequential systems have the aim that the products and the components in the system replace one another over time. And this not necessarily seasonally, but across the years. The typical example for this last one, for instance, would be a successional system in which you start out with more light demanding species and the products you can derive from these, and move the system throughout different successional stages until you return the whole species, the whole system back to an initial stage or early successional stage. And then the last way of separating the system strip-wise, so if you look at the spatial separation of the components, you can separate them in strips or in rows, and you can also include the components on the whole area. And the reason to do this is, again, the effect or the service you want the woody components to provide to the whole system. If you want the effect to be on a full area or have an effect on the full area you are managing, for instance, improving the soil conditions or changing the microclimate continuously over the site, so reducing radiation, etc., then you will try to go for area-wise mixtures. If you are trying to reduce the effect of an abiotic factor like wind, for instance, to protect the crops from mechanic damages against this background, you might go for strip-wise mixtures. And the reason for this, again, would be the trade-off. Where do you get the benefits? Where are the components competing with one another? And what is the interaction you then decide or allow your system to have? And then a few more options that are used in agroforestry systems, which are strongly based on managing the woody components of the systems. So, of course, in the first step, species selection, planting design, and scheme, that is what we just spoke about before. But then the next point actually already addresses quite strongly how you arrange the woody components in the system. So if you are working with rows, how are these aligned north to south, east to west, etc. And then all the options you have to actually change the morphology of the woody components. This happens strongly above ground, so by pruning or by literally cutting back the trees so they resprout from the stump. And this also happens in agroforestry, which is quite a big difference to forestry systems, for instance, this also happens below ground. So roots are also pruned below ground to increase the complementarity between the components that are in the system. So to reduce the root competition, for instance, of the species. And then, of course, the other options that are there, weed control, timing of the actions, etc., how they interact with one another across the growing season. Now I just want to look at a few agroforestry systems and their central goal. In this case, starting out with so-called alley cropping or hedgerow intercropping systems. This is a typical simultaneous system. So you want the components to be on the site at the same time. And it is, as the name suggests, alley cropping. So the crops are in alleys. So the system is designed as a strip-wise system. And the aim of these systems, or the original aim of these systems, was actually also to include nitrogen fixing species, woody components on the site to increase the soil, the properties, to loosen the soil, to air the soil, to increase the soil water holding capacity, etc. And the species that were used for this purpose were species that could resprout quite well from the stump, produced a lot of biomass, and usually, or in the original form, these were cut back at the beginning of the growing season, so they would not compete for light as much with the field crops in its original form. I'll get to a different example later. Down here, we also see a leguminosus species in a cornfield. Second example would be these typical shelter belt systems. Shelter belt systems, as the name suggests, have the aim of sheltering the field crop. It's again, against this background, a simultaneous system, strip-wise system. The difference to the alley cropping system is that you want the shelter to be there during the vegetation period while producing the field crop. And the main aim in our climatic zones here is also to modify the effects that winds can have. So reducing wind speed, reducing wind erosion, so maintaining soil fertility in view of sustainability, reducing possible mechanical damage to the plants through sands, and then a few more side effects this can also have. So reduced spread of pesticides, maybe from neighboring fields, fertilizers, but also possibly odor emissions, etc., on a landscape level. And these effects, or through this modification actually of the wind and its speed, this can increase the productivity of the field crops in the shade or in this protected zone. Then actually a very classical system, the Tongia system, a system that was actually developed by colonists in Myanmar and has later spread throughout the world, which, however, actually is a plantation crop system. With other words, this is a system in which the focus shifted quite strongly from the field crop that was being produced to the woody component. So the wood quality stood in the center of these systems. And nowadays, you will often find this system as an alternative alley cropping system. So if you go through Europe and look at some of the agroforestry systems we have here, the trees that are planted are also being planted for producing high quality timber. And this would also be a actually plantation crop system to a certain extent. The aim of these systems also was that to increase the product diversity, to integrate actually field crops in the early wood production phase. So the phase in which people could not make money yet with the woody components, and with this also to improve the local food situation. And thinking of the differentiation we had before, this would be a typical sequential or semi-sequential system in which over time the woody component will replace the agricultural component because it simply gets too dark under the canopy of the trees. And then I think the last system I want to present in more detail, this would be the successional agroforestry systems. This is actually a management form that has been adapted from the indigenous management forms in South America as a system which also is semi-sequential over time, so where single components replace one another over time and also alternate in time. And the way these are mixed with one another strongly depends on the components that can be found in these systems. A very simple example of such a successional system is what you see on the right side. So what you see under A is more or less a successional development that a forest might run through: stand initiation, exclusion phase, then with first mortality, second layer of stands, and then the old growth situation in which the one layer of the stand might be replaced by a more structurally rich next generation. And in these agroforestry systems, the idea is actually quite similar. So at the beginning, in this case, for instance, we combine palm trees with cereal crops, as long as the light conditions allow this to happen. Once the canopies close, but the palm trees are still small, the cereal crops will disappear because they lack light. When there is, again, more space, so when the palm trees reach an older age, next component is introduced to the system, in this case, for instance, coffee or cocoa. And then this system at some point is regenerated once the production target of the overstory trees, for instance, is reached, and set back and starts again more or less from an earlier stage. And this is a very, very simple form, just as an example, so you get an idea. The central goal of these systems is, or has been, especially in South America, soil regeneration and recovery, so to improve degraded sites, and doing this by mimicking processes we find in nature in view of the plant sequences those natural systems run through. And the aim is simply to speed up the succession that would take place also in natural systems, but would take much longer, by integrating all the components already from an early stage on and artificially integrating them when they are required during the production process over time. And here we just see a few more impressions, which I do not want to look at in too much detail. You can see alternatives also here following, for instance, landscape contours, again, to reduce erosion of water and wind. We see a few systems I did not speak about at all, so systems that include animals, where the trees are used as fodder and give shade. Here from South America, over here from Spain, so the region of Extremadura. You will know the cork oaks in the region, historic land use form that has been in place for a long time. And then alternative ways how woody components can be used as boundaries in the landscape to separate components from one another. And if we now go back to what we are actually expecting from agroforestry, and if these systems have a chance of being more sustainable, possibly, the aim of agroforestry and its management is strongly oriented or directed towards soil properties, which is also why the soil is more actively thought of in management than in a lot of the other systems. And the aim here is to increase soil fertility by using specifically tree litter, by pruning the trees, so bringing biomass to the ground, by choosing woody components with specific root morphologies, or abilities, for instance, to fixate nitrogen, etc. This, again, then should increase the water holding capacity of the sites of the soils by airing the soils with the roots, for instance, of the trees, by increasing the humus content of the soils. And the hope is, through these activities, that the external input and energy that has to be invested in the systems can also be reduced. So in view of fertilizers, in view of irrigation, etc., And the hope is then that this might also make the groundwater that comes from these systems of higher quality. So less leaching effects, less erosion, and the filtering effects we get from the woody components that are there permanently with vivid or live roots. Then currently a lot discussed, or what is also being discussed quite a lot, are the beneficial effects on the microclimate that these systems can have. Of course, for the productivity itself, there are these buffering effects. But one factor that is currently debated quite a lot is the effect of vegetation on the latent heat. So by absorbing heat and transferring the energy into water vapor, that is what latent heat is doing. And we know that a vegetation cover can transform about 80 to 90% of the energy into latent heat, whereas a site with no vegetation, for instance, releases 60 to 70% of heat you can really feel. So it will be simply hotter. So in view of climate change, this is an effect that is currently being debated quite a bit. And then, of course, the hope is by integrating more structural elements in a landscape, that this should have a positive effect on the habitat diversity, with that, of course, also on the biodiversity. Next point, food security is still, of course, an option that, or a topic that is in the room, and these systems will only work if they are efficient and if they can supply or fulfill this function of food security, and continue to do so, especially in regions that are still rather poor and suffer from malnutrition, etc. Carbon sequestration, of course, through integrating woody components, longer living components, and the hope in total then also to reduce the greenhouse gases. And with that said, agroforestry, of course, can provide, I would say, a partial solution to some of the global challenges regarding sustainability. However, agroforestry, of course, alone will not be able to solve these. And finally, since we are in a bar, I could not mention this species. You all will know this species, Humulus lupulus. Nice name. Humulus actually referring to its needs in view of the soil. So it grows quite well, or it needs quite fertile soils, and lupulus, the little wolf, as part of the name, because it grows so vigorously into vines. And if you look at this system, and if you look at the drinks in front of you, you know that this is a very essential system or species that has revolutionized actually beer drinking. We know actually beer drinking is more or less as old as the sedentary lifestyle of humans. So in the oldest writings, we already find hints towards a drink that was beer-like, so made from wheat. However, this component was missing. This was discovered by the monks. And this species is able to increase the durability of beer, and this finally allowed trading beer throughout the whole world, which we benefit from until today. So this is obviously hops. And if at some point our Bavarian hops fields look something like this, you might remember the presentation today and the potential of agroforestry. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention and wish us a nice rest of the evening.